Welcome to Fox Soul's Black Report, your daily source for Black news, Black views, and Black opinions. Today is Friday, May 13th, and I'm Mimi Brown.
And I'm Romeo.
I'm Demi Lobo, and on today's report, developing news for Brittney Griner as it was announced today that Russia is extending her detention. We break down that story. Meanwhile, the House Judiciary Committee is advancing an ethics bill that will require the Supreme Court to create a code of conduct. Then, a police watchdog group wants over 100 New York cops to be disciplined after Black Lives Matter protesters say that they were mistreated.
Plus, we're joined this week by comedian and motivational speaker and author Griff for a look at this week's hottest topics with a side eye. And Jay-Z is planning a social justice summit this summer. We have all that and so much more. This is Our Voice and Our Truth, so let's get it.
Well, we start today with developing news. Russia is extending Brittney Griner's detention for another 30 days. Her request for house arrest also denied. This is a new image of Griner appearing in a Moscow courtroom earlier this morning. Her detention was scheduled to end next Thursday. Her attorney says the short extension could mean the case could go to trial soon. Now, Griner has been jailed since February 17th after Russian officials reportedly found cannabis oil in her luggage. She faces up to 10 years in prison. The U.S. State Department saying the 31-year-old is being wrongly detained and they are working to secure her release. I don't know if we're surprised by this because I think we reported last time that this was going to be extended. But what I did find surprising was that Russian state media on their television, they're reporting that there's a prisoner swap, that they're in talks with the U.S. for a prisoner swap. Apparently, there's a prisoner here in the U.S. Who has been jailed for financial terrorism. And they're saying that they're in talks with the U.S. for a swap with Brittney Griner. Now, keep in mind, the Russian state media, they lie a lot. They are known for their propaganda. They're lying to their people about the war in Ukraine. So we have to take this with a grain of salt. Mm-hmm. And when U.S. officials, when they were asked about this, they called it a tactic to put pressure on them to do the release or to do the swap. But what that says to me is that they are, Russia is open to some sort of negotiation, which could be good for Brittney Griner.
You know, it's really disheartening to know that a $1 million contract turned into possibly 10 years in jail. That's really disheartening to when you put that math together. But her lawyers, they are still optimistic that a trial is coming soon after the delay. And, you know, it's so interesting, too, that we just talked about her wife celebrating a degree and what the WNBA is doing. I think everyone's trying to do their very best here on this side of things to stay positive. But it was really strange to me when she left court on Friday, that video right there actually with her hood over, that made me wonder, she wasn't showing her face, and I just wonder about her well-being right now. I really was just, because I feel like the last time we saw her, she kind of was walking normal, but that just didn't, I don't know her personally, of course, but that didn't make me feel good to see her that way.
The way she was walking, her posture, it almost feel like a sense of being defeated, right? So when you see that, you think about her mental state of mind, her physical state of mind, and we just want her to come back home safe. So hopefully they can move forward what they're talking about doing, get it done, and get her back home.
Yeah, and embassy officials in Russia said that they did speak to her at that courtroom hearing today, and they did say that she was okay. But even with them saying that she was okay, what does that even mean?
Exactly. I mean, because of course I'm going to tell you that I'm okay, but how do I really feel inside?
How do I really feel?
Absolutely. A totally different story. So President Biden, he's nominating the first black chair of the U.S. Sentencing Committee. Sentencing for federal crimes has been a problem for African Americans for decades. The federal agency tasked with fixing the sentencing laws has never had a black member. Judge Carlton Reeves has more than a decade of experience on the federal bench, and he's nominated by former President Barack Obama back in 2010. If confirmed, he will be the first black person to lead the U.S. Sentencing Commission since it was created. Reeves has made his mark in several ways since joining the judiciary. He is the second black person appointed to the federal bench in Mississippi, and during his time on the federal bench, he has not shielded away from speaking up about injustice.
Meanwhile, Democrat Hakeem Jeffries is blasting Clarence Thomas for his stance on a number of issues. We're talking about now during Wednesday Judiciary Committee hearing, Jeffries said in a rhetorical fashion, quote, "Let me ask you, Brother Thomas, why are you such a hater?" Thomas was not in the session at the time. Jeffries went on to list a number of things he said Thomas hated on, like civil rights, women's rights, reproductive and voting rights. All of the issues Jeffries mentioned have come before the court in the 4 decades. Now, Thomas has been in justice. In this time, Thomas has voted in opposition to what most African Americans and liberals have wanted.
And the House Judiciary Committee is advancing an ethics bill that would require the Supreme Court to create a code of conduct. The code would apply to both justices and their employees. It's in response to the controversy surrounding Justice Clarence Thomas' wife, Ginny. She's accused of trying to help President Trump overturn the 2020 election. Now, the bill would also raise standards for justices and other federal judges to recuse themselves from cases when they have conflict. The bill passed along party lines Wednesday, 22-16. It now goes to the full House for consideration. And Supreme Court justices are currently the only justices in federal court who are not subject to ethic policies.
Could period tracking apps be used to penalize women who are planning or thinking about getting an abortion? Well, that's what privacy experts are asking since the draft opinion that would overturn Roe versus Wade was leaked. Now, millions of women use apps that track their menstrual cycles, and the apps can show when their period stops and when it starts, and when a pregnancy begins and when it ends. Now, these apps, they worry abortion activists because if the procedure is ever criminalized, that data could be used to then prosecute women.
Tennessee plans to use federal money meant for low-income people in the state on job training programs. The University of Memphis will work with several state universities and community organizations. They will spend $25 million on the programs. Tennessee has $750 million of federal funding for low-income families that has to be spent. The growth program, which begins in the fall, will help people improve their job skills. The program will also help families with child care and transportation services to and from work.
A Texas court is ordering a lower court to hear an appeal by a black woman who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for illegally casting a provisional ballot in the 2016 election. The state's Court of Criminal Appeals found that a lower appeals court had incorrectly upheld parts of the conviction of Crystal Mason. Mason, she voted in the general election when she was a felon on probation. The provisional ballot she filed out was never counted, and Mason says that she did not know that she was ineligible to vote, and she was advised by a poll worker to submit a provisional ballot. Now, back in 2020, the Second Appeals Court of Texas said that Mason, not knowing that she was committing a crime, was irrelevant to her prosecution.
And the Alaska legislature is the latest state in the nation to pass some version of the Crown Act, which prohibits discrimination against black hair in schools and businesses. The Alaska law only deals with hair bias in schools, but it will be expanded into businesses. The bill passed the state Senate in March. It also prohibits schools from banning students from wearing traditional cultural garb at graduation ceremonies. The bill now heads to the governor's desk. As someone from Alaska, this makes me very proud.
I'm sure it does. All right, so new census data shows that 1/3 of Afro Latinos in the United States, they check the white box on the census form for their race. The 2020 census says about 6.6 million Afro Latinos live in this country. The Pew Research Center says that skin tone and other dynamics such as pride and blackness influences how Afro Latinos respond to the question of race. Colonial influences over their parents as well, their homeland. Those are all factors that make a difference on how Afro Latinos view themselves, and that can range from country to country. This census data, it shows that 25% of respondents called themselves black, and another 23% checked some other race. Now, this study, it found that Afro Latinos, they often experience racism from other Hispanic groups that are in America. And so the most important part of this story, I feel, is that pride in blackness. We are on the heels of the George Floyd protests. Again, rest in peace. And so it was a good thing. It was awesome. You know, I honestly don't like the person of color line. I'm not a strong advocate of person of color because I told you there's a friend of my mom's who is not a black woman, and she calls herself a person of color because she's kind of affiliated by whatever means she affiliates herself. And so I thought that was very interesting that the Afro Latinos weren't checking the Hispanic box. They were more so checking the black box because there is a pride in being black right now. It's in to be black.
You know, Pew Research Center just did a study earlier this month. It's titled 6 million people in the U.S. identify as Afro-Latino. And in the study, they found that more Afro Latinos than other Latinos. They get pulled over, of course, by police, and they're racially profiled. So a lot of them, do check black because that's how they identify. I mean, when you look at them, and that's what you see.
Yes.
You don't, people, they judge you by what they see. They're not waiting for you to speak Spanish. But what I also found interesting was this: is that, and I should, I guess we should all know this, but within their group, they sometimes feel like they don't fit in. They're not Hispanic enough. They're not black enough. So somewhere they're just right there in the middle.
Well, that's why some people bring the conversation, should they have their own box to check? Afro Latinos, like, should you do that? But I do think when it comes to people of color, black and brown, we get stereotyped in so many ways. We get blamed in so many ways. We're put over more than other races. So we do have this sense of we're in this together. So I can see how they want to check black.
But Mimi, that's the thing about being any mixed race. Honestly, black and white or black and any mixed race, there's good and bad. Because like you said, the bad side, if you will, is trying to find where I fit in, right? But the good side is having the opportunity to be able to choose.
Yeah.
And I'll say this in closing, growing up, it'd be like, all right, so you light skin, what are you? Oh, what's your daddy? Oh, is your daddy black? Oh, you black then.
Exactly.
That's what they would say.
Usually how it goes.
Yeah, if your mama's black, you black.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
All right, a Georgia county with a history of mistreating African Americans will most likely be the epicenter of voting issues this election season. A man in Forsyth County is challenging the eligibility of more than 13,000 voters in the county. That makes up 8% of registered voters in the county. It's the largest effort to disqualify voters under Georgia's new election laws. Black people make up only 4.5% of the county's population. There is no information on what kind of people are having their registration challenged, but voting rights advocates are worried non-white people will be purged.
And meanwhile, the California primary election is less than 1 month away. And instead of election officials dealing with mundane registration issues, they're dealing with 104 mail-in ballots found on a sidewalk in Los Angeles. A woman living in Hollywood said she came across 104 mail-in election ballots on a USPS tray. The LA Registrar's office says the ballots were probably stolen with other mail. Officials say they don't think the person who took them was trying to interfere with the election. The Registrar's office says they will reissue new ballots to any impacted voters.
Pennsylvania officials, they're trying to improve the mortgage lending process for African-American home buyers. The Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency released a report this week that highlights the disparity in mortgage lending to black applicants. They hope that these findings will influence the banking industry to improve those numbers. Home ownership in the state for black people is 43% compared to 73% for white people. Now, the report it also says that black applicants have a tougher time getting loans than whites.
A civilian police watchdog group is recommending that 145 New York cops be disciplined for how they mistreated Black Lives Matter protesters during the George Floyd demonstrations. The board reviewed hundreds of videos that showed NYPD cops charging into crowds and at times punching people. The investigation was prompted by the independent board after floods of complaints from people who were either assaulted or witnessed the attacks in 2020. 60% of the recommendations were from the highest violations, which could result in the firing of officers. NYPD officials say the assaults were isolated incidents and not indicative of how the force deals with protesters.
And the family of an Arkansas teen who died after a fight in jail last year is suing the county and the detention center where he was detained. Desmond McBride was in the Jefferson County Detention Center for failure to appear in court last May. Days later, he was hit and head-butted by a fellow inmate during a fight. Afterwards, he complained of being tired. He was taken to the hospital, treated, and sent back to the detention center. But according to the lawsuit, once he was back in the jail, he was not given his medicine. Over the next 3 days, he complained of medical issues, including not being able to see and pain in his head. Other inmates say McBride was vomiting blood and asking for his mother. He was not given any medical attention until the next morning when he was taken to the hospital and pronounced dead.
Michigan prosecutors, they are under pressure from the public to charge a cop in the killing of African-American immigrant Patrick Loyola. Kent County prosecuting attorney Chris Becker must decide whether the cop Christopher Scher will face criminal charges in his death. Scher has been on administrative paid leave, we want to add, since the shooting. Now, police reform activists in Grand Rapids, they're calling on the prosecutor to charge Scher with a crime. An autopsy by the state confirmed that Loyola, he died of a gunshot wound to the head.
Louisiana state prosecutors are charging 3 white state police officers with misdemeanor simple battery charges for beating a black driver. This is the police body cam of the incident that you're watching from 2020. Jacob Brown, Dakota Dumas, and George Harper are seen on the video allegedly assaulting Antonio Harris. They're accused of lifting Harris up by his braids. They also seen on body cam kneeing, slapping, and punching him, even though he is face down with his arms and legs spread. Now, the incident happened after a high-speed chase that ended in a collision. Prosecutors say the cops bragged about the beating in text messages to other officers. The state police agency is under investigation for abusing black people. Misdemeanor simple battery in Louisiana carries up to 6 months in jail and $1,000 in a fine. You think about this situation. We see it happen. We bring you these stories over and over again, soulmates. So when I talk about it, I get a little angry. I get a little frustrated because imagine if this man who was being beaten while he's submitting face down, and maybe he would have reached to get the taser off him or to get their hands off him, and then they would have shot him. We just read a story where the officer did that, right? He had the man on the ground face down, shot him in the back of the head. This could have led to that. So when does this stop? That's the question. When do we come to an end where you no longer are doing this to black men?
Romeo, you know, yesterday you asked the question, how many more of these?
Yeah.
And how long and why is this continuing? You know, when I first read this, what stuck out to me was that they were charged with misdemeanors, which is nothing. It's 6 months in jail, which they're not going to do, and it's a fine of $1,000. I think initially they were the prosecutors or the state police that arrested them wanted felony charges, but they were given misdemeanor charges. You know, what's so upsetting about this is that why it continues, to answer your question, in my own opinion, is why it continues is because there's never any repercussions. They never get in trouble. In fact, the officer, who was it, Dakota Dumas, who was involved in this crime, was the same officer involved in Ronald Green. And if you remember Ronald Green, Ronald Green was the officer, or excuse me, there he is right there, the black man who was pulled over and was beaten to death. They told his family that he got into a car crash. So it's the same officer. So we have the same people doing the same thing over and over and again and getting away with it. And that is why it continues.
Absolutely, Mimi. And I'm really happy that you brought up Ronald Green because, again, with Derek Chauvin, the same tone that they kept saying is that he was one bad apple. But that was a bad apple that continuously, knowingly kept doing things to black people, harming black people over and over and over again. And so when you have a bad apple that doesn't have any repercussions, like you're saying, what do? I'm going to keep on doing it until somebody stops me, until, of course, now he's in jail. But Romeo, and I don't want to keep, because I get frustrated too, just as much as you do, Romeo, but black hair is and has always been under attack. We're talking about, of course, here, but also at black women in their afros and our braids in the workplace. We've had to fight for our hair there. Kids having to fight for it in sports. And so that's something that even with this, like pulling a black man by his hair, you can't really do that to the average white American, the white American man, because they don't have the same textures and they don't have that. So that really is what bothers me, as well as pulling him by his hair.
And not only that really gets it too, Demi. But you know, they sent text messages between each other with LOLs, laughing, ha ha ha. And one of the officers said, "Warms my heart knowing we could educate that young man."
Wow. And you know, this another conversation that we have too is about accountability for police officers. Like you said, if police officers had to carry their own insurance and be liable for certain things, that would be a good way too. That you would be like, okay, wait, I'm going to have to pay for this. It's going to come out of my paycheck
instead of cutting a check and then taxpayers have to pay.
Exactly.